Why, hello, everybody. Um, Welcome to video lecture number 7 for the psychological testing and assessment course. Um, I'm going to go in a direction tonight that I had originally planned on not going, and I will explain what I mean by that. I'm going to be spending a good part, or if not all, of this video lecture on explaining the MMPI 3 and talk about where the differences are with the MMPI 2. I know that in one of the classes I did talk about the MMPI 3 and went briefly through what's different about it. Um, there are a couple reasons I am doing this. One is, as I thought about it, I realized talking about the MMPI 3 would give me a chance to talk about some other things about the MMPI 2. Basically, talk about how the MMPI 3 is different than the MMPI 2. Um, I will be honest about it. I also am talking about the MMPI 3 because I am a little bit surprised at how quickly its use is being implemented. Not across the board, but agencies are starting to use it. Um, and you are probably going to run into it even on your internship, as I think some of you already are. Um, so to at least give you a familiarity with it. By the way, I will say in no uncertain terms that I don't agree with how quickly they're moving on the implementation. I don't think the research is there. I think it's more out of money concerns than anything else. The MMPI 2 has been around for 32 years. And I believe that the publishers of the MMPI 3 just saw a way to make a lot of money relatively quickly by getting everybody who had the MMPI 2 to buy the MMPI 3 because um, it's such a different test that you can't even try to use the MMPI 2 materials with the MMPI 3. Um, so I don't agree with it. I don't think there's nearly enough research to draw conclusions from it. I think they are mistaking large number of participants from large number of studies. And what I mean by that is there are easily 10,000 or more studies on the MMPI 2. Um, I would say 10,000 is probably a vast underestimate. I don't know if there are 100,000 studies, but it's definitely between, it's multiples of 10,000. Um, and I think the developers of the MMPI 3 have sort of mistaken that if they can get a larger sample size, they don't need as many studies in order to draw conclusions, provided they have more people taking the test. I don't agree with that. I think that when you're doing validity, it's better to have multiple studies than one or two studies with very large populations. However, having said that, it um, it certainly is the case that the MMPI 3 is moving forward to some degree. Um, it is that it is that the decision has been made. Organizations have made decisions about the MMPI 3, and in some agencies, it's been the decision not to use it. I brought up before that that's what the FAA has decided. The Federal Aviation Authority has decided that their evaluations will not accept evaluations with the MMPI 3. And if I have an article about that, if I get a chance, I'll go through sort of what their reasoning was besides that. I will also tell you there are a couple reasons why I've not addressed this in more detail before. One is we are just now getting to the MMPI in was the MMPI-2 or the MMPI-3, and we're just now getting to the part of the course where we're emphasizing the MMPI, and we've been doing the TAT up till now. Um, the other is I don't know that much about it. I didn't know that much about it myself. I certainly have a considerable amount of training in the MMPI-2, but the MMPI-3 is relatively new to me. So I've been getting some information that I thought I would share with you here to talk more about how the MMPI-3 is different. What I'm also hoping to use during this lecture is to give you an impression as much as I can about what you will take from the MMPI-2 material and use it even when the MMPI-3 is in place. There are still validity scales, so validity will still be an issue. Using the validity scales will still be a reference point that you will use. It is still mainly broken up into validity scales, clinical scales, and then supplemental scales, which for some reason the MMPI through three they called the substantive scales, but basically it's 33 additional scales that don't really, and most of those are sort of an offshoot of the clinical scales. Um, so you may have there's a depression scale on the MMPI, uh, and then on an MMPI-2, and then a supplemental scale. There might be like five. I think there's five depression subscales on the supplemental scale. So there are five additional scales that sort of tell you a little bit more about the depression um, uh, results. Same with the MMPI-3. There's the clinical scales and the substantive scales, which are seen as adding information to the clinical scales. Um, so still true and false questions, still analyzed using a scoring mechanism, still one that you would mainly score by computer. You would get you would send it into a scoring system where they would uh, not only come up with the scores but analyze it and send you an analysis of what the scores mean. Even here's how to show you um, how new the MMPI-3 is. You have a book. Um, your two texts for this class are from a series of book called the Essentials series, and essentially they're all books that give you the sort of bare bones approach to how to use certain psychological tests. So you have the essentials of TAT assessment, you have essentials of MMPI-2 assessment. Last I checked, there wasn't an essentials of MMPI-3 out yet. So that's how new it is. Oh, and the other similarity between the MMPI-3 and the MMPI-2 is the MMPI-3 still interpretation is still based on um, clinical profiles, and what that means is you base your interpretation on um, the highest scales. So you certainly will look for the highest scale, but if there are two or three scales above 70, you would interpret. So let's say um, the person's highest scores were on depression, but then the next highest score was on schizophrenia, and they both were above that 70 cutoff. Then your interpretation would be based on that combination of scales. So there's a lot of information about how every scale has its own interpretation, but for most combination of scales, there are interpretations based on um, the two highest scales, and sometimes the three and sometimes the four highest scales if all of them are above 70. So the MMPI 3 continues to take that interpretive approach. Okay, talking about um, the similarity, it's still a rather lengthy scale test, although the MMPI 3 is 335 items, so considerably shorter than the MMPI 2. Um, in 2003, they actually started developing um, revisions to the MMPI clinical scales, and that resulted in what was called the MMPI 2 RF. Um, and the uh, so what they did was restructure some of the clinical scales, uh, and then started the development of the substantive scales. So the start of redeveloping the MMPI-2 actually started in 2003 with the MMPI-2 RF. Um, and so there were revisions, and then subsequent, so there were revisions of the clinical scales, then revisions of the supplemental scales, and then revisions of the validity scales. Um, and as with the change from the MMPI 2 to the MMPI 3, there were two major goals with the MMPI 3. One was to expand the item pool to change it so that um, uh, the items were clearer to people, and any sexist or offensive language was taken out, any awkward language was taken out, some items were simplified, and also to update the norms. So typically when you have, and this is something about objective tests, typically when you have a change as major as this, taking one of the most widely used tests and just having a completely different version, those are two major reasons why you usually will have those revisions. One is to change the item pool, to make the items clearer, to take away any outdated language or offensive language. And the other is to update the test norms. And so what ended up happening was there were a bunch of revisions um, to change that. And then to sort of, one of the goals was uh, also to reduce the number, because there really was an understanding and sort of agreement across different areas that the MMPI-2 was just too long, just too many items. Um, and so there needed to be revisions along those lines. All right, so uh, as they developed the MMPI-3, there were different revisions. I'm looking at one study right now that's in the area of what I talked about. Um, one preliminary study on the MMPI 3 when it was still in development was with 8,000 students at college and universities throughout the United States and New Zealand. So there really was a degree to which um, there were there was this attempt to do it across very large groups of people. Subsequent um, studies involved 3,400 people in another study, um, 1,800 in another. So there really was this attempt to come up with really strong norms and strong validity and reliability data based on very large groups of people, which is not in and of itself bad. I just think that the difference between um, having large groups of people is you have more power. If you remember, I talked about, well, you may, power is, I'm sorry, I talked about power in the quantitative research class. But in general, power is the strength of your research. It's basically a statistical measure for how how strong your research is, how strong are the conclusions you can get from it, usually based on number of subjects and number of variables. Um, but there is this difference between power and replication. And I think with when you're developing a test, replication is good. You know, if you do it over and over again, do you tend to get the same results? And you don't really have that if all you're doing is a few studies with very large groups of people. Okay. Okay, so let's talk um, some about what's actually in the MMPI 3. So, like I said, you still have validity scales, you still have clinical scales, and you still have what I'm calling supplemental scales. Um, and then now there's a large number of different scales. This is the other thing I tell you I don't like about the MMPI 3 compared to the MMPI 2, but it's just the way things are. Is a lot of the supplemental scales for the MMPI-2 were developed after the MMPI-2 was already in wide use. So they would collect data in real world settings and use that to um, develop other scales. So the scales were essentially developed um, in response to their actually being used for real clinical purposes. And that's not the way the MMPI-3 scales have been developed so far. Although I imagine later on there'll be real world data supporting their use, the scales, but the scales themselves weren't developed based on their use in real world clinical settings. Um, so just to give you a sense of some of the scales that have changed with the MMPI-2 and the MMPI-3. Let's start with the validity scales. A lot of the validity scales are still the same. There's the VRIN and the TRIN. Um, the VRIN is a measure of whether the person seems to be responding in a random way. The TRIN is when the person seems to be following a pattern of just answering true uh, to, if not to every question, then to a large number of questions. Um, the There is still the L scale and the K scale and the F scale. And again, the F stands for infrequent responses. The L stands for basically uncommon um, responses, and K um, is the scale um, that that the person tends to be over uh, overemphasizing their strengths, their ability to adjust. Uh, there is a scale called the FP scale, which yeah, we talked about before, uh, which is for infrequent. The FP scale, which is also in the MMPI-2, is an interesting validity scale to talk about. It is a scale that measures um, responses that are infrequent in psychiatric patients. So it basically takes the F scale and the F scale, which is of course infrequent responses, and it takes the F scale and says, well, is the person giving these infrequent responses because they're not trying real hard, or um, resistant or whatever? And then it also says another option is, or is it that they are given these infrequent responses because they're actually severely impaired psychiatrically? In the FP scale, is a scale that helps measure um, how um, unlikely it is that these responses would have occurred, the responses that make up the F scale, that these responses would have occurred in an individual who has a because of their psychiatric illness. In other words, it is a scale meant to measure items on the F scale that don't tend to occur in individuals whose main problem is their psychiatric illness. Um, and so, and then there's an FS scale that measures um, the items on the F scale that are medical in nature, somatic in nature, and tend to occur very rarely in medical patients. And so the FP and the FS scale are ways to put into context what the result of your F scale might be, why uh, you might be getting those results. Okay, now, so the validity scales are fairly similar. Now, when you get to the clinical scales, um, they just they're completely different. So basically, you have different um, nine different clinical scales. Um, None of them are the same. So there are nine, and of course with the MMPI 2 there are 10. And I'm sorry, no, uh, no, there are 10. There are 10 clinical scales. I'm sorry if I said nine before. Um, there are 10, but none of them have the same name as the MMPI 2. So the restructured clinical scales are um, demoral, and you can look up. I know you don't need me to go through the MMPI 2 scales because you have those, but I'll tell you what the MMPI 3 scales are. Demoralization, general unhappiness and dissatisfaction, somatic complaints, physical health complaints, somatic complaints, low positive emotions, lack of positive emotion response, antisocial behavior, rule breaking and irresponsible behavior, um, ideas of persecution, that's number 6, um, dysfunctional negative emotions, and that would be dysfunctional negative emotions. It's interesting to keep in mind. So demoralization is general unhappiness. So that first one I mentioned is general unhappiness and dissatisfaction. Then there's the low positive emotions. That one, demoralization is more just general unhappiness. Low positive emotions is more along the lines of what we would think of with depression. Dysfunctional negative emotions is more along the lines of anxiety, anger, and irritability. Um, um, 8, ab- aberrant experiences. Uh, those are unusual perceptions or thoughts associated with thought dysfunction. And then the last of the clinical scales is hypomanic activation. And that comes across as overactivation, aggression, impulsivity, and grandiosity. So notice how some of them, the names are completely different, but notice how there are similarities. Now I put it back. I put it on pause and came back here because I got uh, my book, and I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about um, where some of the. So if you look at the clinical scales on the MMPI 2, um, and you look at the clinical scales on the MMPI 3, you can see that the names are different, but there is a lot of overlap. For instance, scale 1 on the MMPI 2 is hypochondriasis. Now, that is defined as the scale that measures the tendency to manifest physical symptoms as an expression of emotional discomfort. Okay. And then look at uh, on the MMPI-3, you have the scale is called somatic complaints, which is diffuse physical health complaints. So it's kind of moved away. Um, the MMPI-3 still addresses this issue of physical complaints, but the main clinical scale is just saying whether a person seems to have a whole lot of different physical complaints. In the MMPI-2, there was sort of an implication that it was what's the word here? Physical symptoms as an expression of emotional discomfort. That's taken away in the MMPI-3. It's more just, does the person have diffuse physical complaints? And not, could it be related to being a hypochondriac? Could that be part of it? Okay, and then it's like you've got the depression scale, and it measures in the MMPI-2, it measures symptoms of depression. Now, notice with the MMPI-3, you have low positive emotions, um, which is interesting in that lack of positive emotional responsiveness is how it's defined. So that's a definition of depression, uh, but it's not as it sort of seems to be recognizing here that the term depression has come to mean more than that. So it's a scale measuring lack of positive emotional response, and some of the other supplemental scales are used more to determine if it's depression. Um, okay, so and notice that you have you had in the MMPI-2, you had one um, and two specifically related to psychotic um, uh, like delusions and thought disorder. Um, you have paranoia and you have schizophrenia in the MMPI-2. In the MMPI-3, you do have you also have two scales. One is specifically ideas of persecution, which is paranoia. So it's almost a direct, one scale, a parallel move, paranoia to ideas of persecution. And then instead of schizophrenia, you have aberrant experiences, unusual perceptions of thought associated with thought dysfunction. One change that I hope you're seeing here when it comes to the MMPI-3 that seems to be an understandable change is that um, one of the major movements here is to move away from talking about the scales in diagnostic terms. Ideas of persecution is a description of what the person is experiencing. It is not a diagnostic classification. So even though usually when we're talking about ideas of persecution, we would be talking about paranoia, the clinical term paranoia is not what's used here. So there really is this movement away from talking about symptomology in purely diagnostic terms. Instead of schizophrenia, it talks about the person having unusual perceptions. Instead of paranoia, thoughts of prosecution. So the symptoms are described more than the diagnoses. Um, Instead of describing the person as depressed, it's talked about that the person has low positive emotions. So So you have um, uh, there is not as much of a reflection of diagnoses in the chart. And I will tell you, as much as I don't like the change to the MMPI 3, that is one uh, that is one big change. Let me tell you about something in particular. Let me give you a specific example about one limitation with the MMPI 2. Uh, and this is something I wanted to talk to you about uh, as we went along, regardless of whether we talked about it in the context of the MMPI 3. Let me read to you uh, how the schizophrenia scale is defined in the MMPI 2. Measures severe alienation, self contempt, apathy, cognitive disruption, inertia, feelings of unreality, alien impulses, and motor and sensory impairment. Notice how those are unusual experiences, and notice how sort of the equivalent on MMPI 3 is on MMPI 3. The equivalent on the MMPI 3 is the aberrant experiences scale, and it is defined as unusual perceptions or thoughts associated with thought dysfunction. Notice how that scale and the schizophrenia scale are defined similarly, but it's not called schizophrenia here. That's been the one thing, in particular in court cases, can be a real limitation with the MMPI 2, which is you can have a person score high on the schizophrenia scale, but not be diagnosed with schizophrenia. They could be having unusual thought perceptions for other reasons. So you kind of can get caught. It's like, well, wait a minute. You gave Mrs. Smith this test and she scored high on the schizophrenia scale. Why are you not diagnosing her with schizophrenia? And there could be, um, the person may show difficulties with unusual perceptions, but show no other signs of schizophrenia. Um, the person may have a very strong uh, but unusual belief system. Um, so there can be a lot of things that underscore a high score on the schizophrenia scale without it meaning that the person has schizophrenia. There, good example, and this goes to the uh, the combination of scales. There is a scale of depression and there is a scale of schizophrenia. Very often, you will have someone who scores their highest and above the clinical cutoff scale on depression and schizophrenia. Those two are interpreted together. If you look at the interpretations of them, they are often, um, if when you have a high score on both those scales together, it is often interpreted as being reflective of something like major depressive disorder severe with psychotic symptoms, because depression sometimes can be so severe that it has psychotic symptoms associated with it. Um, so even though the person has scored in the clinical range on schizophrenia, they are not being diagnosed with schizophrenia. They are being diagnosed as having psychotic symptoms, but that's not the same as schizophrenia. So the names of the scales have been somewhat um, problematic, um, just because there can be a lot of misconception of why someone scores high on a certain clinical scale but is not given the diagnosis associated with the name of the scale. Okay. Okay. So, um, now let me, okay. So, m- for the next few minutes, I'm going to focus primarily on, well, hold on a second. My plan is right now to focus primarily on the MMPI 3, because what they're doing, um, compared to the MMPI 2 is not really apples to apples. They've taken a completely different approach to it, but I might be able to make it, um, yeah, okay. I think I can make it sort of, um, relative. So here's what happens on the MMPI 2, you have what are called subscales for each of the major clinical scales. So you have scales that are meant to um, add to um, add clarification to why you got high scores on the clinical scale. So let me just, and you have this in your book, but I'll read it to you. So under depression, there are seven subscales for depression. Five of them are called just D. So there's D1, D2, D3, D4, D5, and then there's DO and DS. Those seven scales are meant to clarify the depression score. So you have D1 is subjective depression. Um, and that is defined as a negation of joy in doing things. So pessimism, just an overall sense of pessimism. Um, uh, D2 is psychomotor retardation. Um, so basically, lethargy. The person doesn't do much. They tend to be very limited in anything they do. D3 is physical ailments, being sort of preoccupied with physical ailments. D4 is mental dullness. Um, and so it's sort of an unresponsiveness, a distrust of the person mistrusting their own psychological functioning. D5 is brooding. D5 is sort of repetitive negative thinking, or an emphasis on repetitive negative thinking. Um, and uh, DO and DS. DO is obvious depressive symptoms. So the ones that are more obvious, sort of more superficial items that would typically be associated with depression, and DS is the more subtle ones. And DO and DS are often used as a way of determining if the person might be overemphasizing depression, uh, overblowing the severity, exaggerating the severity of their depression. When you get to uh, the other scales, the sort of I'm calling them supplemental, but that's the 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 sub. I'll just call them the supplemental scales, although they have a different name on the DSM three. They aren't directly related. None of the scales are related directly to any of the clinical scales. So it's not like you have five scales or seven subscales, excuse me, seven subscales that directly relate to the low positive energy scale. So all the scales are seen as kind of relating to the other one. And so, or I'm sorry, all of those supplemental scales are seen as relating in, or as possibly relating to all of the clinical scales. And so instead of a D1, D2, D3, D4, D5, you have suicidal and death ideation scale. You have the helplessness, hopelessness scale, the self doubt scale. These are all the scales that could very well be associated with depression, but also could be associated with other things. Instead of the one subscale relating to physical complaints, you have the what's called the malaise subscale. Actually, you have a series of three somatic scales that are all related to whether the person is overemphasizing or not over, but is focused largely on physical complaints. There's malaise, which is sort of an overall sense of physical impairment, neurological complaints, and eating complaints. So all of those are scales that could be in some way associated with um, with um, any of the other clinical scales.